you very much for your kind introduction. It's my pleasure to talk about my research. And I think precariat has something, you are right, has to do with the proletariat. But proletariat is mostly associated with working classes, employment, but the precariat is mostly about more broader sense of precariousness of life, So I think this project grown out of doing this project. And last year I was on sabbatical, so I was tremendously interested in this problem and try to figure out how do I develop a new project associated with those issues. And also, many of you know that I've been doing research on popular culture, but mostly thinking about popular culture has to do with mass media, mass communication, and everyday life practices, less about this aesthetics aspect. But then, I'm more kind of draw into those aspects because aesthetics, loud, okay. So aesthetics is about a certain aspect of sensible experience, And so my current project concerns a sensible fabric of experience in which things are produced as art. I look at both material conditions of production of things as art and modes of perception and regimes of affective categories that identify these conditions and thought patterns that characterize and interpret them. Sounds very abstract, but this is the best way for me to talk about this. So instead of talking about the concerns traditionally by social scientists on the accumulation of information, the production of knowledge, and the verification of inequalities, my main concern is about the truth of equality. I know every time when you mention about truth, it's difficult to talk about it. But it doesn't really mean it's not important. So I'm trying to try to understand not only temporal and intellectual equalities, but also subjectivities and truth procedures associated with those equalities. Basically, I'm talking about thoughts, intelligence, and time, and those are the ways I think about those issues. So in terms of today's talk, let's see, turn it on. Okay. What I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of made in China. Then secondly, I talk about the idea, the disappearing factory. Particularly, I want to talk about what does it mean when we talk about disappearance. Then I'm going to talk about how cinema engaged the disappearing factory. And so in this talk, you are going to see lots of film clips, and hopefully they will be interesting. So the first one I want to show you is something has to do with commercial made in China. As you know that made in China expresses China's connection to the manufacturing of goods for the world market, especially through labor-intensive industries, right? That's very obvious. So in our everyday expressions, we see lots of things like designed in the United States, made in China, right? But this kind of expression tends to reinforces the division between intellectual work and manual labor, between the U.S. as a site, as a country of intellectual properties, and China as a country of production, right? But this is a very simple kind of way of thinking about what's going on. So what I want to do is let's problematize this idea of made in China. But I want to begin with how does the Chinese government talk about this, right? So I want to show you this commercial by the Chinese government called Made in China with the World. So actually, as you can tell, first world commercials are always very loud. So it's not by design, by College of Humanities, right? So I think the Chinese government love this idea of having loud commercial. But the idea is that there's a shift from made in China to other kind of ideas like created in China, innovated in China. So there are many ways to talk about this. So in recent years, particularly since 2005, 2006, the Chinese government and many people in China began to talk about creativity, innovations, especially by using technologies. One of the key way of talking about this is to treat culture as part of an economy. Actually, culture produces profits, and that's exactly they're thinking about. Just thinking about all the ideas, the ways of telling stories, what we learn in the humanities would not producing any money, right? And that's not possible, right? And this is how the Chinese began to talk about this. So they try to rebrand China as a country associate with creations and innovations rather than simply production. Meanwhile, innovation and creation have become industrialized. Let me show you one example. This place is called 798, which is a name for a factory established by the Chinese government in 1952 when Chinese government first launched a 5-year plan, which is a model learned from the Soviet Union. The 5-year plan is a kind of a way to think about how state-planned economy really works. So this factory was established back then and with the supporting of Germany, East Germany at the time, producing semiconductors, radio equipment, and so on and so forth. So after many years, and this factory was relocated and began to be in the process of decline. Then, so this is the old kind of factory. I think the artist tried to shoot this image to show there's something disappearing, particularly the workers, right? Literally. So, and then you see this began to show up as a kind of an art district. And this is one of the first examples of art, culture, create values. So you can see the machines become an object of art in contrast to other kind of fine arts as a way to kind of draw people's attention to this kind of change. And this whole workshop turned into a huge gallery. You can see the old slogans are still there. Long live Chairman Mao, that's basically what it says. Yeah. And many Chinese artists began to lease spaces in this place. Zhao Bandi, who is famous for using panda as a way to create arts, and Zhang Dali, who is famous for his graffitis, and Sui Jianguo, who is a sculptor, play with this Chinese symbol, the suit. And Huang Rui, and they try to deconstructing this, criticizing this idea of harmony and prosperity, right? Very critical. And then you have gender bending as art, So by Cai Xin, who is a Manchu actually. And then the old factory turned into a restaurant, So if you are not nostalgic, and you can go there and eat. But then high fashion versus the industrial kind of a background, So this gives you an idea how post-industrialization began to work. And next, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of disappearance. So uh, it's very obvious to talk about the disappearance of Chinese factories, when we think about the shift from made in China to created in China and innovated in China, right? But actually, the word disappearance is very complicated. It's not simple, it just means something not there or, absence, physically absent. So there are several ideas I want to mention. Three ideas, three meanings. So a factory becomes transient. It is no longer present. It has passed through the present to become part of the past. This aspect may be about the physical disappearance of a factory, but more importantly, is often about an understanding, a sensibility, or a way of thinking through the factory's disappearance. A disappearing factory marks loss of jobs, unemployment, laid off, and changed system of welfare and security. It points to the loss of pollutions, noises, industrial wastes, and improved quality of air and water, so on and so forth. It means that the space occupied by the factory, both physical and social, becomes emptied, and thus is available for other purposes. So that's the second one. The first one. Second, even when the factory does not disappear, its existence is no longer sensible, whether becoming marginalized or no longer registering social economic norms. The Chinese factory, especially the state-owned factory, as the case of 798 shows, no longer represents the danwei or work unit system, which is a kind of a traditional socialist welfare system. So that is a very important marker. And that's the second one. The third one, the conventional image of the factory becomes displaced or substituted by other images. And yet, within these new images, the essence of the factory still exists, but no longer legible or recognized. This is especially within the so-called post-industrial and consumer-oriented practices. I want to show you an American example. For example, this is a brand clothing. We tend to pay attention to runways, fashion shows, but we pay less attention to what happened behind the front stage. In this particular case, has to do with the huge tragedy happened in Bangladesh, right? And this happened on daily basis. For example, in the United States, we love Apple products, we love iPhones, but actually there are lots of reports about workers jump floors. They want to die, but the company simply force them not to die, and there are those kind of cases, prevent them from dying. So for us, the issue is how do we think about cinema engage those meanings of disappearance? Okay, I want to tell you that this is a research, ongoing research, so there may be certain things are incoherent. So I'm happy to get your feedback and to change or to modify anything. So this is how I think about it. When I look at watch lots of films during the research process, then I began to think about how do I analyze them. So what I'm thinking about is the best way for me to think about this is to read lots of writings on art and politics, particularly about broader issues related to aesthetics. As you know, whenever we talk about aesthetics, we can talk about a range of issues, not necessarily just about fine arts, right? We can talk about philosophical issues, historical issues, cultural differences, and so on and so forth. But anyway, so I want to propose that when we think about those issues, we can think about different ways in which cinema engage the thoughts. You know, when we talk about regime, we often think about political regime, government, but actually regime is about a way of thinking, you know, about a kind of a epistemology support certain logic of doing things. So that's why I'm using the term regime. Ethical regime, representational regime, aesthetic regime. I'm going to explain them as we go. Aesthetical regime of cinema. Basically, for me, cinema as an artistic expression, but its main purpose really aims at serving the community, address its history, creativity, and everyday life. So there is an intimacy between the temporal fabric of a narrative factory and the temporal fabric of cinema. Basically, this is a relationship between narration and narrative, you know, and the filmmaker engages the community as if he or she is a member in the sense of seeking truth and good life, and this is often we talk about ethics. So one might speak, you know, the Western aesthetics like Plato's writings on distribution of images that would best serve the ethos of the community, or we think about Confucius' ethical aesthetics, and but those are not the things I'm thinking. I'm thinking mostly about Mao's speeches at Yan'an in 1942. I won't be able to go into details, but basically he gave a speech to lay out the principles of how artistic production work should serve the interests of the socialist China and things like that. And lots of those ideas become really influential. So we talk about, for example, socialist realism in cinema, support the factory as a work unit, you know, supporting the socialist welfare system. And this is the standard mode of living for those living under socialist system. But of course, nowadays it's different. So we're talking about a different kind of realism I call the social realism. Basically, this takes on the disappearing factory by documenting changes of life in China's shift towards what I call the do-it-yourself way of living. So basically, you're no longer associated with a particular system. You have to do things on your own. You have to make life, you know. So life becomes more like a life-building projects rather than you try to fit in the norm. Okay, so let me show you a couple clips. The first one is a documentary film about the impact of the decline of heavy industry on the workers and their families in the Tiexi district of Shenyang, China. The filmmaker Wang Bing used a consumer digital camera in the production process. And the film is very long, it's more than 547 minutes, 9 hours. So, and I edit and to 2 minutes and 40 seconds, give you a sense what's happening. Basically, when you watch those clips, you think, oh, what's the connection? So rare, right? That's intentionally done that way. So it covers basically everything happened in their daily lives. And if you look at the workshop inside, not much work is done. And this is actually most of the videos were produced in the late 1990s. So reflecting that period of time, all the state-run companies are in decline. And so people, since they don't have much work to do, so they play chess, they sing, they sitting there and chatting, and some of them having their, haircut and talking, just doing lots of those things. But anyway, so the key point is that the boundaries between productive work and practices of everyday life are blurred, you know. And so this is the first one. And the next one is more updated, and this film is going to be released in 2 days in United States. So not intentionally preview, but it's actually interesting. If you are thinking about why there are so many Chinese students today in the United States, and this might tell you something about it, what's happening. But anyway, think in American English. This film is about 3 college friends over three decades building a business on an English learning school in abandoned state-owned factory. Okay. So basically, for me, this film shows a new spatial relationship of production from the manufacturing of goods to the manufacturing of souls. And so the English school basically is all about, producing the right kind of people, training their brains to work, right? So let's watch the first clip. So basically, this clip is about entrepreneurism, right? And so in the school, they learned how to differentiate between horny and aesthetics, between Me Too and Ditto, right? And they learned about which one is more more tasteful and better taste, more refined taste, and also what would be a better way to express affection. And so those would be the good example to show how souls are trained. They are more like social workers in some way. So for me, this is about the substitution of a Danwei mode of production with life-building projects. And so that's the first one. And second clip from the same film. So this clip is the longest one. So for me, it's very clear the production of American dreams in China is part of the production of Chinese dreams, and so an important aspect is the development of what I call utilitarian cosmopolitanism, with a certain kind of neoliberal take on failure, basically. And of course, we can talk about what do I mean by neoliberalism later. But there are the 3 components, 3 segments. Visa mock interview basically is about cross-cultural training. It's like applied anthropology, right? Secondly, think in American English basically is about some kind of a multilingualism. You can speak multiple languages, but you need to learn about think in different languages, switch the codes, and that's the second one. The third aspect, performing the art of failure as empowerment through positive thinking. Basically, that's very important because without being able to address failures, you can't really move on, right? And that's the key. So the key point is that this kind of production of new kinds of production is all about producing new kinds of subjectivities, new kind of ways of thinking, new kinds of Chinese who can address worldwide issues, and this is kind of a very obvious. Let me move on to the next one, and the first one is the longest. So, representational regime of cinema creates a distance between the temporal fabric of a narrative factory and that of cinema. The critical turn in representational cinema reveals a sociological aspect of the role of filmmaker as the one who knows better than the worker herself or himself about the precariness of her work. And there's a parallel between the sociology of the factory as a regime of repression and the representational cinema. Representations of the factory and its associated life reveals what is behind the factory, labor's connection to the discipline and power, exploitation and repressions. The poor, the underdeveloped, the less educated have no other choices but become exploited. And they do nothing but laboring, feeding their own stomachs. They don't simply have time for leisure. They work all the time. And this is the common way of thinking about this. One example I want to show you is from this documentary called Manufactured Landscape. This film is about the Canadian photographer Edward Bertinsky's observation of changes in landscape due to industrial work and manufacturing. Lots of those are about China. So I want to show you one clip. When you watch this clip, it's basically, this clip is very long. It's more than 6 minutes. For me, there's no difference between watching this for 30 seconds versus 6 minutes, right? You got the point. Basically, it's about the massiveness of the assembling line and how the workers are disciplined and how they are trained. There are many other clips in this film like that. So I won't really talk about this. This is very obvious. I'm just going to move on to the next one. This film is about Factory 420, although this is a 24 City, but 24 City is the name for the real estate development project. The factory is called 420, but it's basically on that site. The Factory 420 was demolished to make space for the real estate development project. But this film basically documents, is a feature film, but combining documentary and storytelling techniques to talk about changes. There are lots of interviews in this film. And I want to just show you one clip. His film is very complicated, but in this particular clip, it's really about preserving memories, and also partially has to do with, you see this identification card and also the International, which is the song they sing in Chinese, and of course about demolition as well. So I have done ethnographic research on this particular site over the years, and so this was the factory actually before the demolition, and in 2007, and now you see the same site. It's all replaced by high-risings, So, and there's a shopping mall next to it, and it's extremely expensive. Anyway, so that's about this site. And the last one I want to talk about briefly is the aesthetic cinema. And this one is not strictly about fine art, but more about a general sensible fabric of thought and a mode of experience. Disruptions in the divisions between waged work and leisure, between manual labor and intellectual work, between production and creation, between the laboring subject and the intellectual subject. Aesthetic cinema makes the disappearing factory thinkable. Let me show you one clip. This one is short, then we will have a conclusion. We should be done in a few minutes. This film is, the story is about a steel factory worker who decides to make a piano in order to fight for the custody of his daughter who loves playing the piano. Because this is also the period the factories are in decline. He doesn't have a lot of job. He's semi-unemployed. He doesn't have a lot of income. That's why his wife divorced him, and he can't afford to buy a piano. So this is a kind of situation. The clip I want to show you is it's very short. It's only okay. So you are familiar with the music, and this is actually very entertaining. But the point I want to make is that Confucius often think about music entails harmony, right? This is not about harmony. This is actually critiquing, using music to critique the idea of harmonious society. And but that's the one point. Another point is that this really highlights the sensible fabric of experience through using bright colors, spectacle, and talent and skills and all those things. And remember, this is happening in abandoned factory. They don't really quite fit in the space. And so making a piano is impractical, right? So the steel piano doesn't serve for any utilitarian functions, but it symbolically bridges the gap between the impossible and hope. Their performance work exercise a demand. Their pursuit of the impossible shows a fidelity to faith rather than belief. Faith is about something you keep on doing things instead of kind of tying to a certain return. So the presence of the future is very important in this. So this often can be analyzed in terms of the politics of future. But anyway, so that's the about this one. And so let me just make a couple comments on the intellectual and temporal equalities. The first one I think we can think about is the right to sensible experience, including affect, pleasure, leisure, which are not supposed to be available to the group of people who we consider them living in precarious conditions of life. And the second one has to do with contemporaneity. This is about the co-presence of time as a source for caring for oneself. Partially we think about people who do work all the time, labor, versus philosophers, artists who have time, is people who are laboring, they don't have time to take care of themselves, right? This is, there are lots of those kind of arguments. But I think part of the equality has to do with the co-presence of this kind of leisure time, the time of doing nothing, basically. So we can also identify certain thought patterns that are not usually attributed to them, and certain things, if you actually watch those clips, they're very thoughtful. So this is the kind of things I want to look at. Of course, this is an ongoing project, and I haven't completely finished yet, but this is a report. I give it to you. So criticism, feedbacks, thank you very much.